Let's talk about writing visual novels. The technical side of visual novels has gotten fairly accessible. I've seen a lot of indie works that match studio works in terms of the graphics or the audio or the programming or whatever, right? But the writing is usually pretty crap. And even the studios often don't do very well. So let's talk about how to write visual novels better. I'm not telling you how to write a better story. I'm not telling you to write with better themes or more interesting characters. On the contrary, I don't care whether you're doing something philosophical or the lowest possible trash. Either way, you are still communicating via a visual novel. So what I'd like to teach you is how to communicate via a visual novel. Whether you're communicating a philosophical treatise on the nature of mankind or whether it's just porn, you're going to need to communicate via the visual novel that you're making. So let me tell you how to do that. One way of looking at it. This is called the two-channel method. And the basic idea is that your visual novel has two channels. It's got the visual and it's got the novel. Now, this might sound pedantic, but it's really important because there is an unusual distinction between these two channels. These two channels are completely separate. In most works of art, the channels are tightly interwoven. If you watch a movie, the dialogue and the visuals can't really be separated from each other. They can't run at different rates, for example. It's always going to be lockstep for everybody. But in a visual novel, your visual and your text are entirely separate channels that can run at entirely different rates, and they don't even have to talk about the same thing. This is incredibly important to understand because once you understand it, you can get ideas about how to communicate what you're trying to communicate at the volume you want to communicate it at. Let me give you an example. Your visual novel is starting with the player moving into a new apartment and they're carrying a box around, and their friend from 10 years ago is in their apartment saying, "Hey, let me help you move in." In order for this to progress, the player character has to put down the box. It's not intended to be important. It's just part of the continuity. Having a prop adds to the reality of the scene. It makes the player feel like they're there. But how do we render it? The naive way to do it would be to have an image of the player putting down a box on a desk or whatever, and then we have text down below that says, "You put down the box." This is extremely common, and it's also very bad. You do not want to do this. And the reason you don't want to do it is because you are using both channels at maximum volume. You are essentially unloading a double-barrel shotgun. Think about it as typing in all caps, right? You are telling the player that them putting down the box is the most important thing in the scene. And unless it is, you don't want to say that. Like if the box is full of drugs or something, sure. But if it's just a box and it's just there to keep the reality of the scene, you do not want to shout it on both channels. In fact, you don't even want to shout it on one channel. You want to use a part of one channel. So how do you do that? Well, you just think about which channel you can use, and that depends on your personal style. If you're using art that is fairly easy to make, like 3D or AI generated or something, you might have an image of the player saying, "Oh, hey, it's Bob," or whatever, and then you'll also draw them, with the box already down on the table. And then over here you can show Bob saying, "Hey." And then you can have text down here that just is whatever, their conversation, right? The box has been put down. You have preserved the reality of the scene. The player feels like the scene exists because the props feel like they exist. Everybody's blocking feels like it exists. Congratulations, the scene exists. And you've established it without using either channel on full blast. Instead, it's in the background of one of the channels. The main point of this image is that the player and the friend that they have are communicating, and you can add details to that, like what the player's facial expression might be. But you're using a part of that channel to add to the reality of the scene by doing prop control and pacing and staging and stuff. Now, one downside of this is that this is an image, and that might be expensive. If you're doing 2D art that you're manually rendering yourself, it could take hours to make that one image, and maybe that's not worthwhile, in which case you would have a different set of priorities, and you might use text. So you would have, the classic portraits, and then you would say, you put down the box so you can talk to your friend. You might even have a little teeny animation just to indicate as well. So in this case, because your communication is not super clear, it's not super vibrant, you might use the background of both channels to communicate that reality, to build that scene. You can use them together, but without shouting. Both of these communications have a different purpose. Both of them are talking about, how you're going to start talking to your friend now, but in the background, they harmonize to make sure that you understand that this physicality of the scene exists. Since you can't render that physicality with, bespoke art, you have to make sure that you double down on making that physicality by using both channels just very subtly. You can also try and build it by using channels more aggressively, but the louder you get, the more capital letters you seem to be using. Let me give you an example of how this really helps. Let me say one of my least favorite progressions in an indie game, the wake up. The player wakes up in the morning. They get out of bed. They open the door. They go down to the breakfast table. They get a bowl. They get some cereal. They get some milk. They pour the cereal in the bowl. They pour the milk in the bowl. They sit down at the table. Endless pedestrian crap, right? This can be very easy to fall into if you are writing it, right? Because you're like, oh, well, what happens next? Well, the player gets up and gets breakfast. That's what happened next. But if you're thinking in terms of, I've got two channels to communicate with, and I want to communicate that the player got breakfast, but it's not the focus of the scene, suddenly you realize that there are a whole bunch of ways that you can do this much more effectively and efficiently without wasting a bunch of time. You don't have to show visuals and text for all of that crap, because that's like continuously unloading a double-barrel shotgun in the player's face. You're typing in all caps all the time. Instead, you figure out what you actually want to communicate with the player, and that's what you communicate. The breakfast becomes a reality-building backdrop. For example, you might say in text, you wake up and go downstairs. And then you can just show a table with a bowl of cereal on it, and the player looking down at the bowl of cereal, and congratulations. Now the point of this scene is that the player is super tired, but the reality building, the fact that there is cereal in this universe and you are now partaking of it, that still exists. So the scene feels real, but you haven't spent 10 minutes of your player's life yelling at them about breakfast. So you have the main point of the channel, the tired player, and then you've got the reality building backdrop of the breakfast cereal. And the thing about this is how much breakfast you put in the text is up to you. You can put in the text, you wake up and go downstairs. Or you could put it up in the text, you wake up and get breakfast. And that might seem like, not a big difference, but it is. If you mention breakfast in both of the channels, the breakfast feels important. But if you don't, then you're just building a rolling scene where the scene itself has to feel real, but the things going on in it are mundane and don't require too much attention. So how tightly your channels work together is incredibly important. Let's say that the point of this scene is that someone walks in on the player while they're eating breakfast and feeling super, super tired. And that person walking in is the important part of the scene. And we really want to sell that. Well, how do we sell that? We use both channels at full blast. So we draw a picture of someone coming in. Hey, I'm here. And there's the player in the foreground. And we also have a text pop up that says, oh my gosh, it's Jamie. Because both channels are focused on Jamie, we understand that Jamie is incredibly important. We don't have to describe why Jamie is important. We know Jamie is important because we used both channels to say so, even without any explanation at all. And this is the most important part about this, in my opinion, is you don't have to explain. Almost nothing in a visual novel requires explaining. Nearly everything is about making sure the story is rolling and the player understands what's important. You do not have to explain why Jamie is important or why the box is important. All you have to do is make it important by communicating properly. Now, this is all well and good, and I do recommend that you sort of get that into your brain. There's also a couple of other things we could talk about, like the fact that if you make the player click a button to do something, it's going to be considered important, or at least it's going to be considered really, in part of the reality. But what I want to talk about a little bit before I sign off is the fact that these channels do not have to cooperate. And that's something that can feel very artsy-fartsy if you take it too far, but the channels have different purposes, or can have different purposes. And there's no reason why you have to constantly use them both to support each other, because the gap between them is often as important as how they work together. Here's an easy example, right? Your character is suffering from PTSD, and to them, breakfast is important because that's how they keep cool. That's how they stay focused, right? They feel anxiety, they go down, they have breakfast, and they really focus on making breakfast. This is something that you could communicate by explaining it. You have PTSD and you need to make breakfast to try and keep your cool, whatever, right? Or you could simply show it. And if you show it on one channel for a long time, like say the visuals, and you have the player making breakfast for a long time, maybe it's a really intricate breakfast or they just take a really long time to make it, that tells the player that this is something important, especially if you do show the player's face, the character's face, struggling a little bit, looking worn. The secret to this is that there's no text related to this. There might not be any text at all. The difference between the two channels becomes quite glaring because it's no longer communicating smoothly. With no text involved, the player is like, why aren't you saying anything? And because the two channels are no longer working together, there's this gap that the player has to fill in. Why is there no text? You can, of course, also just have the two channels both working, but working at different, on different things. If the player is making breakfast, but the text is talking about, how they're going to murder 12 people and a kid or something, you get a very different feeling because of the difference between what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And you could swap that around. You could show visuals of violence and talk about how you're making breakfast. These differences can feel quite artsy-fartsy and forced if you overdo it. But if you do it just a little bit, it'll work out in almost every narrative, because very few people are all surface, right? If you show something happening and you talk about something that's just a little bit different, that tells you what the characters in that scene are thinking. That tells you what's going on besides the scene itself. What do the characters want? Well, you can tell what they want by what this channel says as opposed to what this channel shows. Now, that sort of thing is stuff that you can work out on your own time if you'd like, but I just wanted to be super clear that this is a very, very easy way to think about communicating what you're trying to communicate. You have two channels to communicate on. How much of each channel will you use to communicate the thing? You do not have to be full blast on either channel. If you work together at the same time, it's basically typing in all caps. At least that's my opinion. Let me know what you think.